there, welcome to another Cloud Security PunchOut match. My name is Patrick Pusher, Technical Evangelist at Orca Security, and today our match is between Orca and Point CloudGuard. The PunchOut series is a collection of competitive comparisons between Orca and other cloud security solutions, and you can find them all at www.orca.security in the resources section. This comparison of Point CloudGuard was done as of January 10th, 2021. Let's begin by reviewing our scenario for this comparison. We've got an AWS cloud environment that we've inherited from an acquisition that our company recently made. We know very little about the lab other than the lab diagram that's been provided. We're going to deploy both Orca and CloudGuard and point them at our cloud environment to determine what the biggest security risks are. Deploying Orca Security is very straightforward, so let's dig in. I've logged into my AWS account ahead of time, so I will leverage the provided CloudFormation template to create the necessary role and policies that Orca requires. To save time, we'll fast forward through the deployment, but know that you can easily deploy Orca in less time than it takes to watch this video. It's as easy as running the CloudFormation stack and then taking the generated Amazon resource name or ARN, pasting it in, and selecting Connect Account. Orca will then verify the permissions and then begin side scanning workloads and querying AWS to discover both cloud and workload risks. Installation is a one and done process, meaning that from this point on, all of our resources that debut in our cloud account will be necessarily discovered and evaluated by Orca. For the most part, deployment of Point CloudGuard is straightforward as well, with one notable exception. CloudGuard leverages the same cross-account role connected to policy that Orca does, but the process is not template-driven, which means that you will have more steps to do manually. One difference is that CloudGuard has both a read-only and a write mode that can overwrite some of your security group settings based on policy that you establish. Of course, this means that CloudGuard carries privilege to affect change in your cloud accounts. Orca does not. Let's take a look at our findings next. At first glance, CloudGuard appears to do a reasonably good job of inventory. Just about all of our resources show up on the inventory side. We appreciated the inventory showing us highest value resources and not every single one explicitly, which was a problem for other CSPM offerings we've looked at in the series. Even the NAT gateway that I failed to clean up from previous lab exercises showed up. Upon further digging, however, I realized that our container was nowhere to be found. Now this is curious, since Check Point have really begun to position CloudGuard as a CWPP solution protecting workloads, but clearly there's a lack of support here. In fact, CloudGuard is unable to understand risks inside of regular instances, containers running on those instances, and containers running as a service under ECS or Fargate. So for our modest but real-world representative lab, despite these CWPP capability claims, CloudGuard wasn't able to provide any information at all regarding workload software vulnerabilities, risks, or compliance. In terms of cloud security posture types of findings, we found CloudGuard to be very similar to other offerings. Lots of information, but very little that will significantly improve my security posture and lessen the risk of compromise. While we were not able to work directly in the alert section of the product, a quick review of CloudGuard documentation clarifies that alerts are simply another way to consume compliance findings. So let's focus there. Point CloudGuard has good support for a wide variety of compliance standards across AWS. We were limited in the compliance standards we could run, but we were able to run a bundle and see the output, which was well organized and presented and accurate. Although we weren't able to run all of the rules in each compliance bundle, we can see them all. Looking inside of the AWS CloudGuard Best Practices rule bundle, which is representative of just about all of the rules in the platform, there are almost 1,000 rules or checks. However, like the CWPP claims that Check Point makes, further investigation into the rules themselves really tell us the true story. If you parse out the simple port checks, like this one, you are left with far less unique rules, about 223 to be exact. It's important to note that these port checks are done without any perspective whether there are services running behind those security groups or not, or whether traffic is actually routable to the resources in question, which will mean dealing with some false positives if your goal is to understand what services are truly exposed. Of those rules left, they range from useful, like ensuring encryption settings are enabled, to less useful, like ensuring resources have names. Next, let's take a look at Orca's findings. Let's navigate to the Alerts tab, and immediately we can see that Orca has found malware in 3 places: our container, on the host that runs the container, and on our internal Windows management server. Malware that is exposed outside of your network is always risked as compromised by Orca, as it's indicative of an existing compromise that is exploitable from the outside. We see some observations around non-compute resources as well, like our publicly readable and writable S3 bucket. Next, we'll take a look at our container. Here we've got a service vulnerability to do with SSH. You can see that Orca rolls up CVE findings on the left, and instead of flooding you with individual alerts, Orca has aggregated them and presented them as a group. If I update SSH, I will take care of over 80 individual CVEs. Scrolling down to the attack vector, we are reminded that not only is this container directly internet-facing, which is why this alert is risked as hazardous, but that 2 other systems are accessible from the host that runs this container, a clear indication of how risky of a configuration this really is. We have several of these service vulnerability roll-up style alerts in our lab, 5 to be exact. We also found some unsupported host OS alerts, all for workloads based on Ubuntu 14.04. Next, we found AWS keys in what appears to be a configuration file, which can be disastrous from a lateral movement perspective. Orca tells you where they were found on disk and which user and account they belong to. I also see how these credentials can be harvested within the simulation command section. In the same preventing lateral movement bucket, we also found insecure private SSH keys. But you'll also notice that since Orca has perspective over your whole cloud estate, it's mapped out the systems that the keys provide access to. In fact, there was another SSH key found that provides access to 2 additional systems in our cloud environment. We found weak host passwords, which means commonly used passwords or those found in published breach account information. A quick look at login attempts, and I can tell that logins have definitely been attempted from the outside when this machine was exposed. We've also got several unpatched host OS alerts, which is another great example of a roll-up of vulnerabilities. Over 600 of them in this case. You may notice that Orca has risked this alert as hazardous, even though it does not have public inbound connectivity. Why? If we review the attack vector map, you will find that moving laterally from one of our other resources that is internet-facing, namely XYZ container host, is possible. Lastly, we have a high-profile trending vulnerability associated with Windows Kerberos that is called out specifically due to the attention it's received. A fix is available, and so action should be taken to address this high-profile vulnerability that's received much attention lately. In terms of compliance, Orca has support for a growing number of compliance standards, with rules that measure storage buckets and accounts, databases, identity and access management attributes and associated policies, monitoring, network, serverless, instances, and more. Orca has support for all the key tests that CloudGuard has, and even has a handful of those permissive port rules we spoke of earlier. In addition, Orca has support for compliance standards that are aimed squarely at applications and operating systems, like Apache or distribution-specific CIS compliance checks that identify workload configuration risk. Compliance can be accessed centrally, where broad information across all standards and trends are available, or per asset, where compliance findings of a particular resource can be investigated. So let's summarize. Both Orca and CloudGuard were able to tell us that our S3 bucket was publicly readable and writable. Although in the compliance rules we were able to run, this wasn't clear. Only after manual reviewing more of the rules that were not available to run was this determined. This is about where CloudGuard stopped. Only Orca was available to find malware in 3 locations where CloudGuard found none, despite claiming CWPP capabilities very prominently across Checkpoint marketing material. In fact, none of the workload observations across any of our resources were detected, including both EC2 instances and containers. Orca told us about both unpatched and unsupported operating systems. Unsupported operating systems carry a slightly different risk profile that's similar to unpatched systems, but a little bit different. These systems are necessarily out of date from a security perspective, since the operating system has fallen out of support and the vendor has stopped issuing patches. These are low-hanging fruit for those with bad intent. CloudGuard wasn't able to discover or tell us about our container at all. Only Orca alerted us regarding insecure private SSH keys and the systems they provide access to, sensitive AWS keys and the accounts they map to, weak host passwords, and high-profile trending vulnerabilities. Both Orca and CloudGuard were deployed easily with cloud roles and policies. The process for CloudGuard isn't template-driven, but it's straightforward nonetheless. If you're looking for Kubernetes support, CloudGuard requires the installation of agents. This is not the case with Orca. For that, we gave CloudGuard half marks. CloudGuard entirely missed all other workload observations, as it doesn't support EC2 instances or our container. Checkpoint clearly understands the importance of this support with the emphasis of CWPP capabilities in their marketing materials, but it falls very short in practice. If, for example, you had privileged cloud keys in a workload that was accessible via remote exploit, you would never know. Or what about if you had malware planted in a publicly accessible workload indicating an already compromised resource? Similarly, this would go undetected by CloudGuard. CloudGuard did a good job of detecting cloud misconfigurations and compliance with support for many data security standards. When we dug into the rules associated with CloudGuard, however, we found that nearly 3/4 of them are relatively shallow checks on different port combinations from a security group port perspective. To be clear, Orca has similar rules, but to the tune of less than 30 of them. This is because when calculating risk associated with the exposure of a particular workload, Orca always reads not only the security group configuration, but also the existence of CDN and load balancers, IP addressing, network configuration, route tables, internet gateways, and local host configuration, including firewall config and what services are listening on which ports. Orca uses this information to assign risk to vulnerabilities that are discovered. No more false positives and no more alert fatigue. The only other point that CloudGuard scored was an academic one, the fact that it represents no impact to workloads. This is true, but it's true because CloudGuard simply lacks any perspective over our workloads. The fact is that only Orca was able to gather all this intelligence with no impact on workloads at all, even while resources are stopped. How? Orca is able to determine this information in two ways. The first being the process of side scanning, where Orca analyzes the storage that powers your workloads in an out-of-band fashion. And the second, a healthy dose of context, a mixture of that data-driven intelligence with cloud control plane measurements, including security groups, route tables, IAM permissions, and much, much more.